Now, we're going to talk about pins. And the pin is one of the most important situations to be aware of. And there are many tactics that rely on pins in chess. And not only that, but they can rely on pinning one of your opponent's pieces or even pawns. And other times they can also rely on finding clever ways of breaking a pin, right? So when, for example, we think that we have an effective pin in a certain situation, but in reality our opponent has a way of breaking it, that can actually cost us material or even the game in some situations. That will become clearer by means of examples. So don't worry for now. For now, let us talk about the different kinds of pins. The first one here that I have on the board is what we call an absolute pin. And why that is because the pinned piece, in this case the knight, is unable to move. Any knight move would be illegal. And the reason for that is because it's pinned to the king. So a pin of a piece where that piece is standing in the way of the attacking piece, in this case the rook, and the king, then we have an absolute pin on the board. And this is important because an absolute pin is the one situation where the pinned piece cannot move. So there are no nasty surprises waiting like we just mentioned. Sometimes you have to be careful about nasty surprises. Let's take a look at the next type of pin, which is a relative pin. Here we can see that the knight on e4 is pinned because of the presence of the rook on b1, and the bishop on g6 is the piece that pins the knight. However, in this case, it's not illegal for white to move his knight. He could, for example, play the move knight to c5. It's simply generally a bad idea because black will capture the rook on b1. So when does a relative pin arise? Well, we can say that it arises where the piece shielded by the pinned piece, in this case the rook, is not the king, but is in general more valuable than the pinned piece, right? So in other words, you would rather give up the pinned piece than you would give up the piece on the other line. So here we can see that even a move like knight to c3 would not be a very tempting move, because after bishop takes rook, knight takes rook, we have a losing position here. However, if, for example, in this position, we had, instead of a knight on e4, perhaps a rook on e4, let's go ahead and do that. Now, the two rooks have the same value. And so it would not matter to play, let's say, a move like rook b to e1, defending the pinned piece, or if we go back, to play rook e to e1, where the pinned piece moves. It's the same effect because the pieces have the same value. So that is a relative pin. Let's check out what a partial pin is now. Here we have an example of a partial pin. A partial pin that is in fact an absolute pin as well. Let's consider what is truly meant by partial pin. Well, here the queen on e4 is pinned because of the king on b1, but unlike the knight in the first example, which could not move at all, the queen here can actually move. First of all, it can capture the bishop on g6, and secondly, it can go to d3 or go to c2. It can move along that diagonal. It could not move along the rank or along the file, but it can move along the diagonal. So this is not quite as comprehensive a pin as the other kinds of pins we've examined, and therefore we call this one a partial pin. Let's take a look at the final kind of pin, and that is a situational pin. Here we have an example of a situational pin. This is kind of a funky type of pin because, well, it appears like there is no pin at all, because the piece that is pinned here is the knight, and the piece that is pinning the knight is the rook. But why is it pinned? Well, it's pinned because given the situation, if we move that piece out of the line of attack, the consequences will be very, very bad. We will basically lose more material or get a worse position than if we just left the piece there and maybe lost the piece. So for example, if in this position white were to play practically any move, so for example, if in this position white were to castle, black would capture the knight and white would be down a piece. But if white moves the knight to e5, then black would give a check on g1 and skewer the white rook, and so he would win a rook. So let us go back and let's imagine if white instead played the move knight to e3. Well, now we see that the bishop on a6, which is influencing the f1 to a6 diagonal, plays a very important role. After rook g1 check, the white knight can go to f1, but it will simply get taken with check. So that move is also not good at all. If it wasn't for the bishop's presence on a6 in this position, then white would have had the nice defensive maneuver knight e3 to f1, or even knight h2 to f1. Notice as well that if white played the move f3 to support the knight, black would use a very common method when trying to take advantage of existing pins, and that is to bring a pawn with the move f5, attacking the pinned piece and of course costing white the game. So that is a situational pin. So we've now examined all the different kinds of pins in very basic positions. Let's now take a look at some real-life examples. In this position, black played the very bad mistake, queen to f7. He placed his queen along the a2 to g8 diagonal, and we see that the queen and the king are both on the same diagonal, and white played the response bishop to c4. This is an absolute pin in the sense that the queen is pinned to the king, but it's also a partial pin in the sense that it is legal for the queen to play the moves e6 or d5, or even to capture on c4. Of course, in this position, black would have one move that is clearly better than all the others, and that is the move rook to d5. In this way, black voluntarily pins his rook, but since the rook is worth less than the queen, this is a very good idea. So in this case, we can now say the position on the board is one of a relative pin. Here we have a second example, and this one is slightly more advanced. White here plays the move knight takes b7, and the whole point is that after rook takes b7, it has been an equal exchange until now, a piece for a piece. But we see that the rook now on b7 is being x-rayed by the white bishop, and therefore we can say that the knight on e4 is pinned. And we see that the knight on e4 is guarding the knight on c3, therefore white's tactical idea is the move rook takes c3. Now, the point is that after knight takes rook, white will capture the rook on b7. We can see that black pays a very heavy price for moving his knight. It is a relative pin, the knight can move, but the cost is a full rook. In this case, in this position, it doesn't matter whether black captures the rook or does not, it's an equal exchange because the price of breaking the pin with the move knight takes c3 is losing a rook. And the benefit is gaining a rook. Problem is that one move earlier, white captured a knight, so he's already a piece up. So it's game over. Here we have an example of an absolute pin, right? Because the white rook is pinning the black rook on f8 to the king. And white can actually exploit this with the devastating move queen takes f7, check. And after this move, it will in fact be checkmate because the black rook simply cannot capture. That will be an illegal move. So the only move in the position is king to h8, but then after capturing on f8, then, well, everything gets exchanged. And after rook takes, it's checkmate. So that is quite a nice example and a very common idea. In this position here, I wanted to attack the white king. This is taken from one of my games, and so I played the move knight to e3, bringing the knight into the attack. However, what I didn't realize is that after the move rook to e1, the knight is pinned. It's a relative pin. I can move the knight, but I will lose my queen. And actually I have no way to unpin or to bring another defender into play. Let's imagine, for example, that this pawn on f7 was in fact on f5. In this case, I could simply play the move f4 and suitably defend this knight on e3. Another option would be if there was no pawn on f3. Let's put that position without a pawn on f3. Now we can see that black would have the resource knight to g4 with check. You see, you can break a relative pin by leveraging other resources in the position, such as the possibility to give a check. In fact, if we go back, black could also play the move queen f4 check, or even the move queen f6 with check. In either case, the pin would be broken, but black would still have to be quite careful in this position, because after a move like king to g1, now there are no checks, and we see that even though the queen has moved, the knight continues to be pinned because we see this rook on e8 is undefended. However, black could continue to play in this position and actually be doing quite well after the move queen to g5, because here the queen would be defending the knight, as would the rook. So two defenders and also two attackers. So there are no problems here for black. Additionally, black has the threat of capturing on g2 with checkmate. So white will have to spend some time dealing with that. Here we have a little bit more complicated of an example. And this one relies knowledge of not only pins, but also skewers. So make sure to check out the separate section on skewers so that you can know what a skewer is. But here black has a very smart move, the move knight takes c4. And the point is that white can capture in one of two ways, either with the king or with the queen. But neither of them works. The reason why capturing with the king doesn't work, black will give a check on b5. And because the black pawns are covering so many squares, white must go king to b3. And now black has to move queen a3 with checkmate. So therefore, white, if he is to recapture the knight, he must capture with the queen. But the problem now is that we see the queen and the king are lined up on the same diagonal. Therefore, after the move bishop to b5, black will win a lot of material. So hopefully you enjoyed that example. I think it's quite a nice idea, and a little bit more advanced. Let's take a look now at a couple more examples. Here we have the possibility of creating another absolute pin. And white can actually do this in 3 ways. He can play the move queen to g5, queen to g4, or queen to g3. In any case, the white queen will pin the bishop on g7 and threaten checkmate. However, what is a very simple point, which is, the possibility of a pin, has a not so simple solution if we were to ask you to find the best move. So if you wish, you can pause the video and try and figure out which one of these moves is best. Only one move wins, and actually, you know what, scrap the hint. So we can see that a move such as queen to g5, well, this would not be a good idea because black could simply capture. And now, after bishop takes, we can see that white has not won anything because of his pin. It's a little bit more tricky to see that the move queen to g4 also offers no benefits for white because black can defend against the pin with the move queen to f6. Now, not only is black defending his bishop, but he's also attacking white's bishop. White has nothing better to do than a move like bishop to g5, and now queen f5. Black attacks the white queen, and white actually has nothing better to do than to exchange the queens on f5. But in that final position, black is actually doing a little bit better. The key is that white in this position would prefer that he have the queen on g3, rather than, let's say, playing this move right now and it being black to move. So therefore the solution, if we go back, is the move queen to g3. Now we attack the bishop, and after the move queen f6, only move, bishop to g5, queen f5. This is the best move in the position. The big difference is that because the white queen is not on g4, he can pester the black queen on f5 with the move knight to h4. We'll see why this is best in a second, but notice how if white were to play the move bishop to h6, black could simply play queen to g6. And here the pin would be broken because the queen would stand in the way. And so instead, white plays the move knight h4, attacking the queen and also covering this important square g6. The black queen actually has nowhere to go except for e4. And now after bishop to h6, black was forced to resign. Yeah, this is, I think, a very, very instructive example as well, and a little bit more advanced. Let's take a look at one final example now. White here has one move that is a lot stronger than any other move in the position. Are you able to find it? The move is queen to g6. Quite a typical idea, but really very, very nice. The point is, black is unable to capture the queen because the pawn is pinned. Now remember when I said earlier on that you have to be very, very careful when the pin can be broken. Black can unpin himself. So let's tweak the board a little bit and see how that may be possible. Let's imagine, for example, if the black queen, instead of being on a1, was still on the same diagonal, but instead was on c3. Then can you see what black would play? He would play the move queen takes c4. By the way, some of you astute observers will have noticed that I tweaked the position in one other way. And that is that in the original position, this pawn, which is now on h2, was on h3. The reason I did this is because otherwise, in this position, if we imagine the pawn on h3, Black would actually have the even stronger move queen takes g3 with check. So, because I wanted to illustrate how to break the pin, I placed the pawn back on h2. But anyway, that's an aside. Let's see after queen takes c4. What happens if white captures the queen? Well, now there is no pin, and so black will capture the white queen, and he has gained a piece. So you have to be very careful about those kind of tactics. Now, if we go another level up, we can see that in fact, even if the queen is on c3, even in this situation, white would be very happy to play the move queen to g6. Because if queen takes c4, white would have what we call an intermezzo. He would play the very clever move queen takes g7 check. And after king takes g7, another intermezzo. An intermezzo, by the way, is an intermediate move, an in-between move. Bishop takes f6 with check. Black must react. He plays maybe a move like king to g6. And now white captures the queen, and therefore, even though black started by capturing a piece, while white had the last laugh because he was able to capture on g7 and then capture a piece back, and so he actually won a pawn in the whole transaction. Let's return to the original position now. Here, black has no such resources. And the problem is that this move is very strong because not only does it use the pin against the black king, therefore this pawn cannot move, but it also creates a second pin. We see that now the pawn on g7 cannot move. Therefore, if black were to play a move like a5, we see that the threat is bishop takes f6, and we have a very nice situation where the pawn cannot take the queen, because it's pinned by the bishop. And the g7 pawn also cannot take the bishop because it's pinned by the queen. And both of them are absolute pins. So therefore this is actually not only winning a piece, but also it's going to be checkmate soon. Now, in this position, black could break both pins with a move like king to h8. But now white could continue with the very, very strong move. He would have a couple of ways to win here, but probably strongest and simplest is bishop takes f6. Now, we can see that if pawn takes queen, the black queen will be lost. And if pawn takes bishop, then after bishop takes pawn, white is threatening checkmate on h6. The best defense is to give up the black rook, but after queen takes f7, white is simply up too much material and the position is resignable for black. So that concludes our section on pins. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned about the different kinds of pin that are possible, and I will see you in the next section.